Ni wako vakante ktanse, ni mayatani awapam tikok. How we have progressed over the course of the summer. We have had the time to talk and discuss, or as we used to say, or we say now, consult. This is a very traditional Indigenous way of doing things, is taking the time to talk and discuss in the summertime. And over the course of this summer, it's great to see that the government has had the conversation around the ideals of justice, because justice in this bill are perhaps the most fundamental element to it. I think about my family story, about who is Indian and who is not Indian under the law. My grandmother met a fine young man named James Ouellette from Battleford. His family had come from Batoche, and they fell in love around 1939. His September 3rd, they had a son named James Ouellette. But then the war started just a week later, and James signed up and was sent to Europe to fight. Went to England and fought his way through the Dutch territory, or the Dutch lands, and into Germany. This is a story of many Indigenous men, but it's also a story about an Indigenous woman. For James was what they called at that time a half-breed, or a Métis person. My grandmother, though, was a status Indian who had the full rights, responsibilities, and the disadvantages of being a status Indian. But because she married my grandfather, she lost her status upon her marriage. She did not know that great course of events in Europe would ensure that her husband would not be there for 5 years, that he would be away, that she would have to raise their son alone. My father remembers as a young boy, because they had no food and no money, having to go into farmers' fields in the Battleford area to dig up potatoes from the farmers' fields while they were not looking in the dead of night, to go there and to steal those potatoes so that he and his mother could eat. Even at the age of 4, he remembers doing this. They could not return home to the reserve at Red Pheasant because they were not allowed, for she was not a status Indian and he was called a half-breed. That is the story of thousands and thousands in this country. And this is what this bill is about. It is about the ideal of justice so that that never ever happens again, that someone can always go home to their lands, home to their traditional territory, home to their people, home to their family and community, to not be denied their birthright of who they are, who their people are. Now, the bill as it was originally presented only went so far, and this has been throughout the Canadian history for 150 years, Mr. Speaker, where people have been denied their rights because they married someone out of love. They were denied who their identity and who they were. But there have been people who have been brave enough in the Senate to continue this fight. Senators like Lillian Dick, Mary Lou McPhedran, Senator Christmas, Senator Sinclair, Senator Watts, Senator Peterson, Senator Joyal, and Senator Sandra Lovelace. These senators have led the fight to ensure that this discrimination no longer occurs. For this is a fight not about today, it is about a fight for tomorrow. About who has status today will determine who will have status tomorrow. And when we go forward with the ideals of a nation-to-nation relationship, as we start to take the Indian Act and dismantle it and try to reform these nations of what constitutes Indigenous peoples and what constitutes an Indigenous nation, as we try to take and put together what was broken 139 years ago, it's going to take time. But as I said, if you have status today, you will have status or citizenship in these Indigenous nations tomorrow. And so it's very important. In the Indigenous tradition, there are many who would continue, I'll rephrase that, Mr. Speaker, There are many, even today, who would continue to deny people's right to return. No matter what this bill may do, there will be some communities who will say, you are not part of this community, you do not have a right to come here. But that is not our tradition. That is not our tradition, because in ages past, people could marry on or into a community, they could become part of a community. There are many occasions when people who were not even Cree or Blackfoot or Anishinaabe could change nations. They could become something different. They could learn a language, be adopted into a new family. In fact, I was just at the reserve in Battleford region, where I had the opportunity of being not only in Mosquito, but in Poundmaker. And Poundmaker had been adopted by a Blackfoot chief, even though he was Cree, and it was for peaceful purposes. And that is a very powerful relationship. So what we did before is not what we do today. Even today, it is not always right what we do to each other. We hear stories from near the Montreal territory of people who marry for love and who are not allowed to stay in their community. But this was not our way. In my house, I have an adopted daughter. She is not of my blood, but she is of my heart. She is half First Nations from Saskatchewan, but she is also half Jamaican. We did not go through the court system in order to accomplish the adoption. We used elders. And they worked very hard to make sure that we did it in a good way, that we did it in a traditional, spiritual way, that it was according to our custom and our customary law. And we love her very, very much. But that does not make her any less of who I am or any less connected to the territory in which I am from. In fact, I even have a greater responsibility to her. And this is what this bill is about. This bill is about the future, about how we treat each other as Indigenous peoples. For why it may be decided here in this Parliament, which has not always been friendly towards Indigenous peoples, it will offer us an opportunity to repair the damage of the past, to welcome home those who have been turned away for too long, to welcome home the great returning to their traditional territories, to community, to the nations, so that we may rebuild and build a nation that we have, the vision that was laid out before us by leaders like Poundmaker, like Big Bear, like Louis Riel. People who had at heart the long-term future of our children. We are told to think 7 generations into the future. Think 7 generations from now, what the implications will be of what we decide today. And so I'm very proud of the stance our government has taken. And even though some may say it's not enough, it is certainly a step in the right direction. And maybe it's not just one step. Maybe it's a giant leap. So I lay my faith in the hands of the Prime Minister, in the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, or Crown Relations, to actually accomplish what we set out to do the talking during the summer periods in the year to come, to do the discussion in the summer period when Indigenous peoples gather across the traditional lands, to do what we call consultation, to make sure that we come up with something that truly represents what 7 generations will look back upon this time and say, we are proud of the decisions that were made by the parliamentarians of both the Senate and the House of Commons. We are proud of what the government did, of what the opposition did, of what the third opposition did, what all parties did together. That we pushed forward to create a better Canada that was more inclusive, but allowed people to reach their full potential. So, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Tapoyaki kitwam, hai hai.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg Centre for his great speech on this as well. I was just wondering if you could respond to the fact that I just wondering what his opinion is, probably more so, on whether First Nations exist. Is it the nation-to-nation piece that everyone continues to talk about? Does he think that is beyond Canada, or does he think that First Nations do exist underneath the Constitution of Canada, underneath the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
What a very interesting question, Mr. Speaker, and I'll try to answer it as truthfully as I possibly can. So Indigenous sovereignty always existed before. These nations existed for a very long period of time. In various groupings, they moved around, semi-nomadic in some cases, using a traditional place, because often it's much easier to know a territory and always stay within that territory in order to conduct hunting and other activities. Also, your spirituality is often related to the land. But we also live in the world today. So as we exist in this world under these laws, I think we've all come to recognize that Indigenous peoples have a lot to benefit from the Canadian Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which are also related to many other international laws like the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man or Human, or the rights or even the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not to say that they can't be complementary to each other. It's just, I think the state has to ensure to not get in the way of people so they can craft a life for themselves. Government shouldn't be about imposing things on people, but allowing to create a framework so people can be successful and have good interactions with each other, to allow people, nations and communities to reach their full potential. Because if they can't reach their full potential, there are costs. There are costs to us not only financially, but emotionally, spiritually, and for all our relations, the land and who we are.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Labrador.
Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Winnipeg Centre for his speech today. You know, it goes without saying the tremendous passion that he has for promoting Indigenous rights and Indigenous people in Canada. And he certainly comes from a long line of advocates towards these principles. I'd like to ask him, you know, he knows that together we have all worked hard to do what is right in building on reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. I'd like to ask him, one, what his thoughts are about the amendments that are happening today under S3, and again, most importantly, to ask him what is one of the most important pieces that we have to continue to work towards to have full reconciliation with Indigenous people.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
So I think there's two things that need to occur. I think we're doing it as a Canadian society, trying to work towards reconciliation. But I think there's also greater, profound conversations that need to happen among Indigenous peoples about what type of nation that we'd like to have. What does it look like? And I don't think we're often very advanced in that. I think we're kind of held up too much in our own construct or a prison of the mind that we have had created for us surrounding the Indian Act. There are too many First Nations peoples in this country, and even Métis peoples, that only see themselves through the prison of the Indian Act. And I think we need to take the time to adequately say, what should we actually be doing? Where do we wish to go, and how are we going to get there? Because it's wonderful that people have extended that hand of nationhood and said, we are willing to be partners with you. But we have to be able to grasp that hand. And I don't think we have, at this time, done that necessary work. Though I do salute the work of the Chiefs and the Assembly of First Nations, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, the Native Women's Organizations, the Native NWAC, as well as the National Métis Council, but we're not there yet. Even there's still work to be done concerning S3 about what constitutes an Indigenous person. As the Métis, will they now become Indigenous under these consultations? These are profound conversations that must be had among First Nations and with Métis people about what that means. How are they going to work together? Because we do not exist in isolation, and we should not exist as opposed to each other. That way.